Welcome to the presentation we're doing today on how to plan out a year of powerlifting training. Before we get started, just a couple quick things that I want to lay down. So as you're watching this, if you manage to make it to the live, expectation is that honestly participate. It's going to make it a whole lot more useful for you. What I'm going to be doing today is I'm going to be picking somebody to basically make a case study out of, and we're going to help you plan your entire year of training. This whole thing is going to be a bunch of like super boring theory if nobody participates. So in the name of selfishly getting the most out of it for you, I really invite you to unmute, jump in. If there's questions you've got, comments, by all means, feel free to do so. With that said, who wants to be a case study? I'll help you plan out your whole year of training.
Hi, Matt. I'm John. Good to
Hey,
see you.
John. How's it going?
Good.
Yep.
I didn't think there was actually anybody else here, but I see somebody now.
Yeah, I think they'll trickle
Yeah,
in.
I think they'll trickle in.
Thank you.
Good evening. Good evening.
Hey, hey. Yeah, cool. So, John, do you want to be case study for this? I'll help you plan out a year of training.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's really interesting because like I have a physically, well, kind of demanding job. So it'll be interesting if we don't get in front
Your
of
audio just cut there. You got a physically demanding job.
so
Uh-huh.
we're not.
Yeah.
I'm probably gonna take notes on my laptop, which I was trying to bring up.
Cool. Give me some background. We'll get into like some notes stuff in a second, but give me some background. Kind of tell me a little bit about yourself as a lifter, and then I'm gonna pull up a screen share and we'll start rolling through.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm having some troubles hearing you. Can you try that again?
Yep. Can you hear me now?
Okay. I'll give you my background and then I'll join on another device, which I was going to anyway. So yeah, I've been lifting for um, probably 5 or 6 years off and on. Kind of through a variety of like higher rep bodybuilding stuff through the winter and then into the fall and the spring. I get more into a powerlifting kind of strength peaking phase. Uh, and then I moved more towards cardio towards the summer, historically, because there's a half marathon in fall. And so, and martial arts starts in September and it only runs until April. So everything made sense logically in my mind to structure a power peaking phase running into like April or June.
Okay. And do you compete in powerlifting or are
I'd
you?
like to.
Okay.
And I've decided I don't enjoy the pounding of running on the concrete. So I'm happy to just stop. I'd rather be nice to do some cardio, but I think I'm done running.
Okay. Yeah, like doing the big,
I
pounding
think I
pavement,
need
doing
to
big
eat a
miles.
lot more and it's hard to eat that much already.
Mhm. Okay. Got it. So you do mostly like higher volume stuff in the winter, fall, spring, you switch over to more strength and kind of peak around sort of April, early summer. And then typically as you move into the summer, you get into a little bit more cardio. It sounds like that might be a bit different for you this year.
Yeah,
With
it'd be interesting to me. I know that like nationals and provincials are later in the year, so it'd be interesting to either maybe throw in a second. You have that summer to train, and there's no interference from martial arts or anything, and so it'd be interesting to just put all that um into a peaking phase. Maybe restructure the whole thing. I'm not sure.
Sure. Okay. And then what kind of numbers are you working with right now and what's your body weight?
Yeah, so I'm sitting at like 120 pounds. And so I did my last test, and I've also been out of the gym for I just got back in a few weeks ago and still trying to get consistent on that. It's been 3 a week. But my lifts, my deadlift was like 345. This was about 2 years ago when I
So I
tested
just
them
want to know
on.
like your best all time, assuming you haven't gone from like 200 pounds
345,
to 120. Yeah.
345 on the deadlift,
Yep. Squat.
265 on the squat, and 165 on the bench. And that's been stuck for like 4 years, the bench. I can't get it moving.
Got it. Okay. And then are there any auxiliary goals? It sounds like one of the goals for you is to do your first powerlifting meet and compete this year. Past that though, any additional goals? Like, are you looking to change your body weight, body composition? What else would be added into there?
Well, so I'm gonna switch. I'm gonna press join on my. It'll switch to the other device, and then I'll answer that. You give me 1 second.
Sure. I'm just going to pull up a screen share and I'll kind of get that all pulled up as we go here.
So I mean, I do. I'd like to hit a 700-pound pull on the deadlift because that's the world record is like 661 at 130 pounds, and there's also a squat there. So I'd like to reach that point. If that takes 10, 20 years, I expect that. I don't need to get there next year. But also something came to my attention. Like I said, I only just got back in the gym 2 or 3 weeks ago, and because bench was stuck, I thought, well, I'll be the most consistent with that, and just with trying to pick up hours at work and to be financially stable. Sometimes that's the only day I can get in there to do with martial arts twice a week. But the thing is, I experienced some chest pain this week. Like, I pushed hospital food cart.
Let's get
I
into
need
that.
to be in better shape.
Sure. I think consistency and load management will help a lot, and we'll be able to address a lot of that there. But it sounds like you have some very powerlifting specific goals at this point. You have some time frames in mind for some competitions, at least for the first one. And we've got some numbers on, okay, best ever. And we'll work backwards from there on where we're at right now with new baseline as we go. Okay. So this is sort of a template document just to kind of fill you in on like how I use this. This is how I personally, it's my like 30,000 foot view when I'm looking at somebody's training, how I like to map things out. Obviously from there, you can get into the details on, okay, well, what are you doing on your Monday workout? How many sets and reps and percentages? But this lets me look big picture, like where are we now? Where's the goal? What are we doing to bridge the gap? What's kind of our process, right? So what we'll do is in building the process, I'm basically going to run you through, if I'm building somebody's program from the ground up, what does that look like? And we're going to use you as a case study here. So you'd mentioned probably kind of in the spring, looking at doing the first meet, right?
I think so, yeah.
Okay. Do you know roughly when that would be, or do you have an exact date?
I don't.
Okay. What month is it?
I haven't looked ahead. I haven't looked ahead to any of the meets.
Okay, you're in Alberta, I'm assuming, based on Okay, cool. Let's just let's just take a look at Alberta powerlifting meets and see what we can find.
Yeah,
and
Calgary. If you're looking at Calgary,
I'm just gonna pull up Alberta and see what's around. Ultimately, it doesn't matter too much. Upcoming contest calendar. Okay. So provincials for you guys is in June, but you don't have a qualifying total, so that wouldn't work. There's one in January, which obviously is a bit soon.
Yeah, provincials could be like 2 years. Like, it doesn't have to be next year.
Yeah. Looks like for Alberta, they've kind of not announced a lot of stuff yet. You know what? Let's just assume an April date and just kind of throw something in for that, and we'll go from there. But I think that's probably going to be the simplest way to go at this, and we'll go from there. So let's just say, okay, end of April would be like your competition day. So like the week of April 21st, which would be like April Come on, there we go. So it would be effectively the last weekend of April that you'd be competing in this example meet, right? So we'll go here and we're just going to highlight this and we're going to say, hey, you know what? This is your meet week, right? April 26th or 27th, right? So we have our hypothetical end date and we've got kind of our starting point here. I know that we've got a couple weeks till the start of the year, but we have effectively, don't know why my Excel is being dumb on a screen share. So it's 17 weeks of training that you've got available to you, right? So the way that I like to look at this is you're a smaller lifter, right? Which means that while I think your strength is actually quite good for your body weight, at a fundamental level, you're going to recover faster than somebody who's like 300 pounds. It is what it is, right? It's not good or bad. It's just a statement of fact, which means that you're probably going to be able to get away with a little bit of a faster taper, right? Typically, the way that we would approach a meet is we'd have kind of from the meet before you'd have a taper, which is like a deload in a way. And then you'd have sort of your peaking block, and then you'd be working on, you know, progressively lighter weights and higher reps as you work backwards from there, right? But let's kind of map things out. John, do you know what your time to peak is, or are you familiar with the concept?
Not really.
Okay. How long are the training blocks you typically run? Are they like 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 12 weeks?
Oh, that's a good question. I kind of go by feel how things are hurting or not,
Okay.
or
How long does it take before things start hurting, typically?
I'm moving. Yeah, I mean 3, 4, you know,
Okay.
4 months,
So
unless, well, 3, I mean like 4 weeks too, right? Like I like to deload around week 4, just because if I keep pushing, I usually need to deload somewhere around 4 weeks.
So like you would do 3 weeks up, and then on the fourth week you would deload, or you would do 4 weeks of training, and on the fifth you would deload.
Usually 3 weeks. Sometimes I have a lot of energy and I have that extra week, but usually that fourth week, I might be able to get away with a max one really good lift on that deload week or something.
Okay, but as a repeatable thing, you can get 3 good
Yeah.
weeks if you deload on the fourth, and you can get another 3 good weeks, and so on.
Yeah, usually what ends up happening is I get through 3 weeks of pretty intense, and then I deload for about 2 days, and then that third day is pretty hard. I actually find some of my biggest lifts are like the first day back too, from like time off.
Interesting. Not on week 3 of your training cycle.
Yeah, it's usually
Okay, cool.
it's
We'll
often
take that
week
into
1.
consideration as we're building it, because it's good and it's bad. I think it's good from a competition context. I don't love the fact that you can get your biggest lifts before you even start the block, though. That to me feels like you might be going a little backwards with things. So
Maybe there's a piece of data I've missed or something, or I've been trying to figure that one out.
that's okay. And ultimately what we're doing is we're building a projection right now, right? Like this is a starting point on like, this is the game plan. We're going to make some course corrections as you go through the year, right? So the way that I'd recommend starting a prep is you basically want to have like the cleanest slate possible, where you're dealing with the least amount of BS, right? So if you have any like little nagging injuries, like you mentioned, you're getting some chest pain, stuff like that, the goal should very much to be like hitting the reset button and making sure you're not stale or banged up from the last training cycle, or in your case, you're able to kind of get back in and get back into shape so that you can actually train productively for a meet. So in your situation, what I'd recommend doing is more of an accumulation style block, right? And so you can see effectively you've got like 1, 2, 3, 4 training blocks before this meet. Works out to about a month apiece, right? And the reason that this block is a little longer is simply that the training is not going to be as taxing because it's more of a ramp up, right? So keep in mind, none of this is like a prescription. It's not me saying you should go do this. This is more like, hey, if it were me, this is how I'd approach it if I was in your shoes, right? But we've got this sort of basic idea here of where you're kind of starting. And the goal with this first block, if we set some focus points. We'll just hide these out and just go here. But if we set some focus points for this block, right, the goal should be really starting lighter than you think you need to. Right. So effectively, I would think about having your block actually start, your typical starting point either on week 2 or week 3, and then you can kind of work backwards from there. And the idea with this is it gives you a lot of runway, because building workload tolerance and kind of getting everything healthy, you want to be starting lower than you can recover from, because if you're starting right at the limit, like, good luck, right? And that's where you can run into a lot of issues with like going back into the gym and be like, I'm going to test where I'm at. It's like, maybe not, right? So starting lighter than you think you need to is probably a good starting point with this. And you do want to have, some comp specific lift, because for you, just having a general technical base as you're getting back into it would be a really great place to start. But you also want about half of your work, of your main work, should be what I'd call secondary focus. So basically identifying what your weak points are and having the lift be limited by that. So we'll get into some specifics on like what those are in just a sec. Be limited by your weak points. And so the idea is this serves two purposes, right? So purpose one is you've got enough competition specific lifts, enough regular squats, regular benches, regular deadlifts, where it's not like you're going to get weaker at those from neglecting them, right? But your focus is very much on laying a clean foundation and getting rid of like the weakest link. I'm not sure if you've seen me talk about like the floor and the ceiling before. So the way that I like to describe it is like the floor and the ceiling is like how strong you are. And then the floor is a little different in that this is your weakest link. It's the thing that's actually going to make you fail the rep or not be able to complete it or not get through a training cycle. So some people's floor can be their recovery, and just nagging injuries. Some people might be that they're, weak off the chest and their pecs just physically aren't strong enough in their bench, right? But nonetheless, the idea with it is if you focus on building the floor here and kind of closing the gap, your training will become instantly more predictable in those later training blocks. Whereas you'll probably end up more in the situation where it's like things are going great until they're not, when you never deal with this if this gap is too big. Cool. Okay. So the idea is floor focus here. So let's get into some specifics on your list, John. Where's your weak point in your squat?
Hmm. I mean, I have some nagging ankle injuries.
Okay.
So
How does that affect your squat? Like, are you going to, like, do you have trouble getting to depth? Do you lose stability? Do your hips shift around? How does that impact your squat?
yeah, that's a good question. Okay, it hurts. I have to warm up the ankles for the squat. I find like I have to take some time, take a few minutes to warm those up, warm up the hips a little bit as well for that. I squat and deadlift pretty well. I'm a sumo lifter, so that does help a bit because my knee has less travel over the.
Yep, I get the
Well,
mechanics of it.
I lift pretty wide.
Okay.
Um,
So if you're going to fail a rep on your squat, are you going to fail it in the bottom? Or are you going to fail it halfway up?
uh, Probably about halfway up.
Okay. So like a little bit above parallel.
Yeah, a little bit above parallel, maybe even a third of the way up.
Okay. Like kind of in the bottom portion, just
Yeah,
coming out of the bowl.
that's the same with my bench too.
Okay. Same idea, like just coming off the chest.
Yeah. And there usually reaches a point where my back takes over and it's almost more of a hinge too
Okay.
around the point. So depending on how heavy it goes, it'll turn into more of a hinge at a certain amount of.
Okay. Got it. And how about your deadlift? If you're going to miss, where do you miss?
Grip often. Usually trying to hold on to it is my fingers are just like sliding.
And is that an issue on singles? Like your 1 rep maxes is where you'll miss on grip, or is it on reps?
Um, Bit of both.
Okay. So for singles, how many 1 rep max attempts have you missed on grip?
Um, I'm not sure how to answer that. I have to think back a ways here on
Okay.
that one.
Because like ultimately with powerlifting, you only got to do it once. So if you can pull all your singles, so like for myself, right? I do block pulls, and because I primarily will deadlift sumo, my block pulls are very heavy because I've taken out the hardest point of the lift. I do them as a way to strengthen my strengths, right?
Hmm.
Um, I can't remember the last time I held on to a block pull for a double without straps, but I've never, ever, 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 ever missed a 1 rep max attempt on a comp deadlift. So
Hmm.
I don't care about, like, grip is not actually a limiting factor in application,
Okay.
right? Whereas I have another lifter, and like they were strong enough to do everything else in their deadlift over the summer, but they just physically couldn't hold on to the bar. So we focused a lot on actually building their grip.
I mean, if there was like I do have like a mild scoliosis too in the spine, so I do have some alignment issues too. I don't,
So your hips will shift around on you, basically.
thinking back, that was definitely a limiting factor. Because I had to take a second shot at that 345, and I just kind of, a little bit more energy, drink a little bit more chalk, get hyped up, and I was able to go for it. But
Okay.
I didn't make
So the alignment
I didn't
more
make
of
the
an
first
issue.
attempt, and I think it was largely, I'm remembering now, back related. Um, it just
Okay. So
difficult.
let's say alignment, and we'll keep it simple. Okay. So we've got sort of the goal of our phase. We have sort of the spirit of what you're doing. That's going to give you the lens at which you're going to look through. Am I adding stuff that aligns with what I'm trying to do in this phase or not? And that's going to stop you from doing 500 exercises and spending 30 hours a week in the gym, right? I sincerely believe most people can train about 5 hours a week, physical job or not. You can train everything you need to get done in less than 5 hours a week. So with your squats, you might have, do you normally train twice a week for like frequency?
Um, I usually train like I have a bench day, squat day, deadlift day. That's how I like to train.
Okay, so you have like once a week frequency effectively.
Yeah. Sometimes I can bring in an extra day, but that's going to be difficult right now.
So you train 3 days a week.
3 days a week should be the minimum, I think.
Yeah, I think 3 days a week is fine. I think you can get a lot done. I think you're gonna struggle to get any appreciable amount of bench progress only benching once a week.
I've had times where I've just come in and done one lift for like 20 minutes. I mean, I don't know how effective it is to just come in and do a heavy squat,
Yeah.
but I've done it before.
So here's how I would go at this, right? I think shorter but more focused sessions will probably be more beneficial, as opposed to having these big giant like squat and a ton of accessories and some deadlift secondary work, blah, 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 blah.
Could I come in, sorry, just from like, could I come in for like 20 minutes the next morning and do some accessories? Is that
There's nothing fundamentally wrong with it. Like if your commute doesn't, if that doesn't mess with like, commute time and stuff, I'm sure it's fine. Most people just prefer like less days going to the gym because like you got to drive to the gym and do all that
It's
stuff.
I can walk there. It's 24/7, and
Yeah, so that's fine then.
more
Yeah, I
out of
have no issue with that. So the way that I think you could go at kind of your training week is, 4 days a week would be a good starting point. You have a squat day where you focus on, sorry, you have a primary lower body day where you focus on squats or deadlifts. You have a secondary lower body day where you do your kind of weak point builders, right? I know a lot of people like doing a squat day and a deadlift day, and then they'll do like the lighter squats on the deadlift and the lighter deadlifts on the squat day. But as soon as you get like kind of strong, your lower back just doesn't recover. So personally, I don't love it. So I like to say if you're gonna do all your squats and deadlifts, do them on that day. and then do all your lighter stuff on the other day. And then your bench, you can have like a bench day and a secondary bench day, same as it's kind of lower body focus, right? And then from there, you've got your main lifts sorted at that point. How much accessory work you add in depends on how much time and what you can recover from, right? So effectively, we've got the bottom of your squat is really the issue, right? Because if you're failing a little bit out of the bottom, the problem is just before that. And so I think going with like a pause squat as a focus point here is probably going to be a really great thing. And also having front squat. And the front squat's going to basically make it where hinging is not an option.
Would that be a lighter? Should that probably be a lighter squat, maybe, for front?
Well, no, train it hard.
Okay.
If you want to get better at something, you should train it.
Right. I mean,
Like you're not going to do your 1 rep max squat on a front squat because then it wouldn't be a weak point.
okay.
Right. So your front squat could be like a secondary day. Right.
Okay, that's kind of what I meant.
The nature of the movement is lighter. And then your primary day could be mostly focused around building your pause squats.
Okay.
And you might be focusing on like, building your sixes on your pause squats, for example, right? And then you kind of taper into the meat. But with the goal of kind of building volume, you might have 8 sets a week here of total squatting, like front squats and back squats. Then you might do like 9, 10, 11, right? And you'll get progressively more sore, and that's fine. You're kind of building that baseline, just that foundation, and whatever you can recover from. If you notice your strength drops off a cliff, okay, so be it. You probably need to dial back. From there, I like to go down to about 75% of where you capped out in that volume block and start out the next strength block there. And this is where I'll start to write the block backwards. So we know that you need to be doing singles on your, sorry, the formatting is going to screw me here. Give me half a second. Okay. So we know that you need to be doing some singles in a peaking block, right? And you'll probably want a couple singles in there and some doubles. And then for your strength work, 3s. And we're just going to use your squat as an example, and then we'll kind of relate how you can do it with your bench and your deadlift after, right? And then we would say like some 5s here. And the way that I like to look at this is you use each block to build a trait, right? So if your goal is you're doing like pause squats and front squats here, right? You're going to go back to comp squats and front squats here, because I think you should keep building that weak point, but transition to a little bit more comp specific focus, right? And then same idea here. If you're noticing that your front squat is getting stale, you could literally just replace the front squat with the pause squat. Depends how long you can run a movement in a row for, right? Everybody's a bit different. I know some guys that train the same lifts year round, others are like 2 months and they need to change it. Otherwise they just start to like, they'll go boom, boom, and then drop off a cliff. So let's assume that's you. And we'll talk about how to kind of organize those in a second. And then here it's all comp squatting. And we'll talk about organization of that in a sec. Okay. So generally through a block with what you had mentioned, I think that undulating the volume instead of doing a linear approach is probably going to be better for you, meaning you're going to have a dip on week 2. So you remember how you said generally like the first week back after a deload, you have your best lifts, right? To me, that means you're probably pushing too hard because your heaviest lift should be at the end of a cycle, not the beginning. Otherwise, then you have nowhere to really go, nowhere to build up to, right? So I would go something like 8-6-8, where you could literally, in practice, what you can do is you can build up to a top set, and then you might do your back downs, right, on this week. And this week, you might only just build up to your top set and skip your back downs, right? And then this week you would build up to your top set and do your back downs, and you just do a full deload. And you'll probably come into that next week one feeling great. But you're not stacking 2 hard weeks against each other that way. Does that make sense?
And I feel like you just said the same thing 3 times for each week.
So top set and do your back downs. Top
Yeah.
set and skip your back downs. Top set and do your back downs. So no back downs here.
Oh, okay. Okay.
Yeah, because you're using your back downs for extra volume, right?
Okay.
Yeah. Now you might choose to go, 868. We're already getting kind of low here for total volume. You might go like, 757 or something like that with a little bit less volume, depending how your recovery felt here, right? This is basically where each block you would kind of say, okay, how did this go? And what am I doing, and making adjustments, right? And then here, I mean, your peaking volumes are going to be pretty low. Like I wouldn't even worry too much about doing anything here. This is one where I would probably go a little bit more linear and go like something along those lines, because you're going to have that taper and you're going to show up to the meet at your best after that, linear deload. Right? So conceptually, do you see how over the course of the training cycle, your reps for your target ranges are higher at the start and lower at the finish?
Yes.
Your variations are specifically targeted at your weak points over here. They're specifically targeted towards the lift that you're trying to improve in the bottom of the cycle, right? And ultimately, it's kind of this like big funnel that takes you into a competition, right? One of the last things that I like to do in the peaking block is, because it's just comp squatting and just the nature of it, you've probably felt this from doing a peak before, is you get pretty banged up pretty fast, right? Is I like to have the secondary day, because it's just going to be comp squatting again, just be like lighter triples. And the weight stays the same the whole block. So for myself, I do like 70% for 4 or 5 sets of 3. And that's every Tuesday, my secondary squat day. It's just 70% for 4 or 5 sets of 3, week 1, week 2, week 3. And it's like an active recovery day, because I'm not trying to build anything, because I've done all my building over here. Right? Okay. Does anybody else have questions on this? Feel free to unmute and jump in if you're just creeping in the Zoom lobby here. And then we'll get into a couple other small things and bring this into a cohesive plan.
And this kind of probably repeats itself over the year, hey?
Yeah, like the ultimately all that's going on here is you're picking your end date, you're working backwards from there, knowing, okay, well, I need, this many weeks to peak. I'm going to do kind of the further out I am, the less specific I can get, the more broad a brush I can paint with. Right. But really what matters is like that.
I was curious, like, how heavy should the peaking taper be? Like those twos and doubles and singles, like.
Yeah. So this is where it starts to get a little bit more individual with how you ramp up. But generally speaking, what I like to do is this. As a data point, you should know what your best set of 6 is, or your best single, or your best triple, or your best double, right? And you can basically reverse engineer the block where here on your squats, like, do you know what your best set of 5 is?
Not without retesting off the top of my head.
Okay, throw me a number on like gut feel of what your best 5 is.
Best 5 is probably right around like 190.
Okay, cool. So like 195 would probably be a PR for you.
For 5s?
Yeah.
Yeah, probably. Yeah. Usually 2 plates is like a triple. Usually I get up to 2 plates being a set of 3.
Got it. Okay. So the way I like to work through a block is basically like this, where because you're a smaller lifter, I want to take smaller swings. So I like to look at reverse engineering a block in the same way as with your whole phase. We would take, okay, where's your meet date? And then work backwards and think, okay, well, how many blocks do we have to do to lead into this, right? We're going to do the same thing over the course of a single training block over the weeks, right? Now, with you being smaller lifter, admittedly good strength level, we can probably get away with a weekly progression model. Like, I don't think you're going to get buried if you have a heavy squat session every week, right? Whereas, you know, somebody who's like 250 or 300 pounds doing whatever the equivalent is in weight on their squat, they're going to take longer and they might need a heavy squat session every like week and a half or 2 weeks, right? And that's where the math starts to get a little more annoying. So conveniently, this works quite well.
Yeah,
So
I find usually it's the compromise on like either the volume or like some of the accessories, like
yeah, we can get into
how
that. But
much,
ultimately, if
like
your
you said,
training
doing
is
100
geared to build your
accessories.
squat, all the decisions you make should be around building your squat. And then, you know, how much accessory work and stuff you do is going to hinge around that, because you're not trying to be the best at accessory. Like, there's no seated cable row competition.
No. And I don't mind doing both lifts heavy on one day if
Yeah.
that's kind of sport specific, right? So
Exactly. Yeah,
you're
it's
gonna
a
have to
good
do that.
skill to build. So for you, I would say, okay, figure out what the PR is that you're working towards, right? And then so that would be like week 3 for you. Week 2, you'd want to be about 95% of that. And week 1, you'd want to be about 90% of that. And so basically your loads on your squat, if you're building 5s, you'd be like 175 for 5, 185 for 5, go for your PR at 195. So you're kind of spending like 2 weeks building.
Makes sense.
Yeah, so that's kind of the gist. The advantage with this style as well is if, you know, 230 would have been the PR for you for triples, right? Oh,
I think 230 would be a nice goal, to be honest.
yeah. So like, you know, I think you get the gist, right? And we basically end up with like, you know, a 205, 220, 230 kind of progression. You know, some of the rounding will be a little hairy. But the nice part with this is you can see how it starts to actually get really linear, right? It's like 85, 95, 205. Cool. Okay. Where there's not this big shock, you're like going to triples and suddenly you got to add 30 pounds to the bar and recalibrate to all this extra weight when you've been doing 5s and all of that, right? So it can start to paint more linear. And so ultimately selecting your weights, you basically, all you need to do is figure out what's the target, that's the PR that you're working towards, or at least what's the number you're trying to get to if you're still rebuilding, and you work backwards from there. And so that's kind of your like phase style. You've got your objectives for what you're working on. Then you can figure out your volumes, your variations, your rep schemes, and figuring out the loads based on your targets is pretty dead simple. The weights are probably the easiest thing you'll do in this whole planning cycle. Okay, so that's 95% of what I want to tackle for today. I don't have questions.
Yes, I have a question on so what happens when, like, if you plateau when you're supposed to be progressing, if you know or you actually regress during a training block, are there adjustment are there adjustments in that block that are made, or do you wait till the next block to make those adjustments?
So just to make sure I understand your question. So let's go back to this example. We're saying like 175, 185, 195. We're kind of talking about this space here. And you're like, you miss on week 1, right? And you're like, I have 2 more weeks. Like, should I just go for it? Or should I shift gears? Right? Cool.
Yes.
Okay. So the first thing that I want to look at as soon as there's a hiccup, right? We're going to assume that like you've got some data behind you on, okay, well, normally this is how much I sleep. This is how many hours a week I work, how much time I spend with my kids, all that stuff, right? And so you got an idea on, okay, what are your externals going to look like? Well, has there been a change there? First and foremost, leading up to this point where I made the miss, right? On top of that, was I having a really bad day? Was it just off? And am I going to probably run into the same thing next week, right? Like maybe you got some big work project dumped on you and you've just been working like 50% more hours this week and it's going to be the same thing next week. That's going to push me a little bit more in the direction of adjusting a bit and maybe going more towards like an auto-regulated kind of model where we might go for like an RPE. So like if 195 for 5 is going to be like at 10, like a max for you, right? We can probably assume this is going to be like at 9 and this is probably going to be around at a 7 or an 8, roughly speaking. So you might say, okay, you know what? I missed this week. I kind of got everything dumped on me. I've got a rough target of about 185 for next week. I don't want to call off the whole training block because I kind of just had one bad session. But I know that next week's going to be pretty stressful for me too. My target's going to be 185. I'm having a great day somehow, and I can do, 195 at an 8 RPE. Let's go for it. By the same token, I'm not going to beat myself up if I do 165 for the day and that puts me at target.
Okay.
So you can just adopt a little bit more of a flexible model, right? Ultimately, these are all projections that we're setting, and you need to be able to kind of roll with that as the athlete, right? And find where's that balance point. I've got a couple guys I coach who work shift work, where some weeks they'll work like 2 days and some weeks they'll work like 7 12s. And you can imagine how that really adjusts things weekly. So I very seldom will give them like, you hit this number today. And I'll be like, hey, I want you to hit something that's this hard. This is my suggestion if things go well. So with that said, that's kind of scenario 1 where you're going to stay the course a little bit more. Scenario B, I think, is probably more common in that you might miss over here on that 195 week where things are going well, things are going as planned, and then you get to the week where you're supposed to hit the PR and you don't hit the PR, right? That's one where, okay, you know what? You're still going to look at your externals, figure out, okay, were all those things the same as usual? Did something throw me out? Is there anything I can change about that going into the next one that'll help improve my odds of doing really well? Okay, cool. But then from there, that's where I'm probably going to re-examine, okay, well, maybe this stopped performing. Let's try it and kind of monitor how things are going. And if kind of walking into the next block with a plan A and a plan B, if you will. I'm like, hey, if week 1 feels exactly the same as before, or even a little better, I'm not going to worry about missing one top set. But if I go into it, next week also feels really bad, I'm shifting gears and I'm going to incorporate more recovery or adjust my volume, or, that's where I'm going to go change. The worst thing you can do is have one bad session and totally upend the whole training program, right? Like you're going to have days. I talk about this actually pretty often. I had a meet prep where it was one of the best deadlift cycles I had in my life. Like I went from a 520 or 523 deadlift up to a 551 in one training cycle. And in that same training cycle, like 6 weeks out, I missed 465. Like I couldn't even take it off the ground. Right. And I was like, it's one day. I actually felt great going in that day. So it was a bit of a like, oh, okay, we're just going to ride this one out. And I didn't change anything with the training program because I'm like, it's one day, it happens. And lo and behold, great training cycle.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. It does. Thank you.
Cool. No problem. Okay. Any other questions before we tie this all up in a bow?
So what I guess I would want to know if you could explain what off-season training is versus, I guess, in-season training. Like I don't understand that
I'm
terminology.
pretty happy if you want to work more into the periodization of over a year with Curtis.
Yeah, for sure. So off season, I don't know if it really applies to powerlifting in the sense that like there is no season necessarily. You know, if we want to get picky with the terms, like here, you go play basketball, football, hockey, lacrosse, whatever. There's like the season starts on this day, all the competitions between this date and this date. And then in between then, you know, it's everything else, right?
Right.
There's kind of meets all year, especially in Canada and in the States. Like if you're in kind of like any of the four corners of the States, like, you know, like Washington, California, New York, Florida, there's meets all over the place.
They pop up too. Like if you miss one, they could pop. Like I was
Yeah.
watching, and they just popped up one in like 2 weeks.
Yeah. I'll see like 6 weeks often where they'll pop up and stuff. But off-season training is effectively the way that I look at it is I will basically run through cycles of this. I'm just going to not peak because this is almost an evergreen kind of model where you have this like rest and recover, get everything healthy, reassess where the misses were from the last cycle, where the wins were that you want to repeat, get some workload tolerance back in, and then go build on that, right? So you're doing like a little bit of work on the floor and then a lot of work on the ceiling, right? You don't get stronger in a peaking phase. You get better at handling heavy weights. You don't get stronger though.
Okay.
If you did a peaking phase and then you did another peaking phase and then you did another peaking phase, if you could survive it, you know, at a fundamental level, if you could keep showing up and not rip a tendon or something, the things that make a peaking phase work are the exact things that will make you get weaker over time. And it's not enough volume and it's going too heavy very often.
Okay.
Right. So off season, I basically do this. And if I have like if I don't know when the next meet is for somebody, we'll generally go through this. And if they're, you know, going to go more than 6 months without doing a meet, or more than 9 months, depending on the person, assuming there's nothing else that we need to consider, I'll generally do a little mock meet or a little testing somewhere in there where we might run through like a little short peak with like an unofficial competition, just kind of see where you're at.
Okay.
But as a whole, off season is kind of just this.
Got it. And my last question would be, how much time in between meets should an athlete have?
Well, that's a good question. I like this one. So we're operating on the assumption that you're going for PRs every time you compete, right?
Yes, of
Okay.
course.
Cool. Well, hey, it's not, as you get more advanced, you actually don't necessarily do that.
Okay.
If you look at like Perkins, for example, you'll see some meets where his total is actually lower. And he's like, he'll like do an RPE 6 on his third attempt and stuff. Right.
Okay.
But that's more like a really annual plan competitive strategy, which is probably its own conversation. But assuming you're gunning for like, all right, my next meet, I'm going for some PRs. The meet after that, I'm going to try to beat what I did this time and so on. 3 months apart is pushing it. I would say that's the absolute bare minimum. In your first year of competing, you can probably do 3 to 4 meets if you want to. I'd be willing to bet that you will feel very burnt out after the third one and question why you lift after the fourth, and probably take 6 to 12 months off from competing by the time you do that fourth meet. A more sustainable strategy where I think there's actually more success in it is competing every 5 to 6 months.
Okay.
You can do less often, but I think as a sustainable, that's about kind of 2 meets a year is the most frequent. I like to have most people compete. And it's not to say you're not going to hit PRs, but your PRs will be different. You're going to hit a new 5 rep max PR. You're going to go PR a different variant. You're going to build up your builder lifts. You're going to hit a new 3 rep max. You're going to do all these other things that build like your base. And then you hit your 1 rep maxes at the meet. And like the wider your base is, the taller that peak is. I see it a lot where people get super excited about competing. They do their first year of competing and they like sign up for meets and they realize like, oh shit, I'm in it. And then like, it's this big, weird slow motion train wreck where they slowly fall out of love with it as they're starting. It's a very strange phenomenon. Yeah. I don't think that's 100% of the people, but I think most people should be kind of 2-ish meets a year. If you're following the advice of like, have your first meet be about just, you know, getting used to it, 3 or 4 is okay because that first meet's not really all that taxing.
Got it. Thank you.
Yeah, cool. Okay. Donna, you've got a question about competing at Worlds in October, and you have a meet in April, and you want to do a Masters meet in August. Do you mind unmuting? I got a couple of questions about this. Okay, or not. All right. So you basically have, a meet here, the end of there we go. Cool. So you have a meet here. You're wondering if there's a meet in August to do, and then you're competing in April as well. So we'd end up with like this one. I guess my question is, why would you want to compete in August? What's the advantage to doing that?
In August, the meet would be a Masters and one I'd have to travel to versus local, just to get the experience of traveling to a meet.
So October would be like the first time, if you didn't do August, October would be the first time you'd be traveling to do the meet.
Right. For the past three years. I did nationals, but I had a real bad showing, so I don't like to count that one. So
Okay.
and I'm 68.
Yeah. Okay, what would be, is it exclusively the goal of doing that competition to just like get some reps with traveling and competing?
Yes.
Okay, you're not trying to break any records or PR or win or medal or anything like that. Like you don't have to QT or any of that.
At Worlds I am for the bench press.
Just in August, just this one.
No, instead of Worlds will be at regional, you could set world record at regionals this year. So wherever regionals will be that haven't come out, I do want to try to set a world record at the bench press. So if I do it, I can't do world. I already have the national record. So whatever I can do.
Right. Personally,
Okay.
I wouldn't try to hit records here and here as a Masters 3 lifter. I think that if you were going to do this with the goal of like traveling and getting some good lifts in and just getting the feel for that so that you can show up as prepared as possible on kind of all fronts for the big meet closer to the end of the year, I think that's a great way to do it with, hitting some, RPE 7 or RPE 8 singles on the platform over here. And just kind of seeing how you respond to traveling, figure out, what changes you got to make. Do you bloat up when you fly, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
But at a fundamental recovery level, you've got like, what would be 1, 2, 3, 4, 10 weeks. And it's really actually 9 weeks of training because you probably take a really easy week after the meet as well.
Right.
So, right. So you're starting to chop up your training cycle a lot where you're kind of riding on the ragged edge. Most of the Masters lifters that I've seen who really try to push the meets together and push on all of them, it ends up being a little bit of a mess. And then if you get injured at all in there, it's like, well, you're kind of nursing all the way through here, and it can shoot your chance of this. So it's kind of a matter of picking, okay, what do you care about? Do you care about, hitting some PRs here, or really going for, on a stage that you can set a big record and we're eligible to do that?
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. That's good information.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. Great. So, couple last things to add in. This is perfect in theory. I love it. And if everybody's year went like this, I would probably just do what everyone else has done and make some AI program and sell it for $100 a month or something, and everyone will be happy. But life happens. You get sick, tweaks happen, a lift stops responding, and you need to change strategies, all this stuff. You go on vacation, maybe you don't train 365 days a year. So what the heck are you supposed to do about all that? So, easy way to approach this. Everybody's going to respond a little bit different to, getting sick, but a great rule of thumb is if you're out for a week, roll back the training by a week. So if you were like on week 2 and halfway through week 2, you got sick, just go in and repeat week 2, and that's going to obviously shift all of this down a little bit, right? Where then you're going to need to adjust, okay, how long are you spending here? Because your end date doesn't change if you're doing meet. But just repeat the week that you were on. If you're away for a week, if you're away for 2 weeks, roll back a week. If you were on this week, you got sick for 2 weeks, restart the block over here at the 175 week. And use that as kind of just a way to get back into things, right? Extended sickness, stuff like that. A little bit of a hairier. I too nuanced to really productively make any good statements in today's presentation. And then finally, for vacations, you can take kind of the same approach. But the other thing you can do is if you know that you're going to go on a vacation, just for simplicity, let's say you're going to go on a vacation like on this week here. Just plan the vacation to be your deload week. Go get a great pump in the hotel gym and then just go right into week 1 of your training the next week. And you'll probably be just fine. And you can have a nice vacation and enjoy life. And it comes at, for most people, almost no compromise. Injuries are the last one. So injuries, not always preventable. Often they are if you're being intelligent with how you're approaching your training and not trying to just redline everything all the time. It works as a beginner, but as soon as you've been lifting for like 6 weeks, it stops working. If you have a tweak, right? You don't have to do this with your whole training. So if you tweak your quad, you don't have to back off on your bench press, okay? But a good rule of thumb is if you don't have a hard end date in mind, like let's say you didn't have this week here and it wasn't a meet, it was just, you were just training off season. Okay. I like to take, if it's anything that sets you back more than a couple of days, right? Or a week, even where it's like you get a couple light sessions in and then you go back in and you're still feeling it. It's impacting your strength. You're not feeling as good outside the gym. Personally, I like to say, all right, we're going to take 3 to 4 weeks and just work on a progression. I'm going to start at 15% of my max and just do reps of 15%. I'm going to go to 30. I'm going to 45. I'm going to go to 60. I might go to 75 for an additional session in there. And basically just hitting a real hard reset button on it. If you're able to do the movements, it's just like your strength, your technique is impacted and you're kind of waiting for something to heal. That will throttle things back enough where 9 times out of 10, it's going to give you a good framework at least to work with. Everybody's injuries are going to be different, but if it's just like a tweak where it's just not going away as quickly as you'd hoped, I find that to be a good starting point. Because often, the pain will go away a whole lot faster than the injury will heal. And then that sort of 3 to 5 week ramp up will stop you from going in circles. It feels like a long time sometimes doing it, but I can't tell you how many people I talk with where they like had a tweak and then it still kind of bothers them like 6 months later. And then when they're peaking, it really bugs them and they have to miss some top sets and they're doing all, I'm like sitting here being like, it's been 6 months. Like, why didn't you take 3 or 4 weeks and just get healthy so that you can push really hard in your training instead of just circling the drain all the time?
What do you do at that point? Like just super light stuff? Like
if you have that sort of longer standing injury?
yeah. Or like, no, like, let's say going back, like, let's say you feel like you tweet something, like, I feel like I just tweet something and I'm kind of at that point, like.
Yeah, so that's kind of what I was going
Like,
at
would you just
earlier,
go
is
and
like,
do, like,
just say, okay, the
machines
next
and-
session, I'm going at 15%, 1.5. And then the session after that, if everything's good, I'm going at 30%. Session after that, 40, 45%, and just kind of build up in those 10, 15% increments. And it should feel, if you're doing it at the right pace, it should feel better every session.
My temptation is always to go and like use the pack deck, like.
Yeah, probably not the greatest. Like a big loaded giant stretch is maybe not the best thing to do right away.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay.
I got one more question, Matt.
Yeah.
So this might be a silly question. Does the planning of a block change depending on if an athlete is cutting or bulking?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah. It's generally not going to impact your timing all that much. Typically, where you'll see the changes is in how aggressively you can progress each block and how much volume you can tolerate, especially in like your secondary and your accessory stuff. So personally, how I like to approach things is if I'm going to do any kind of energy deficit, so any kind of cutting stuff, I try to get it as far away from the meat as we can. Not realistic for everybody. If you're trying to cut 20 or 30 pounds, you know, you're going to be waiting a long time to compete, right? But nonetheless, you know, ideally, if I get to pick, I try to get it, you know, kind of over here, you know, 8 weeks out, something like that. Try to be done cutting for the most part by then, just because the training only becomes harder to recover from, right? With that said, if we take this example here of like, okay, well, we've got sort of 8 weeks and then we've got 8-ish weeks over here as well, right? Well, here I'm probably not going to do as much accumulation. I'm probably going to keep it more in that like 7 to 9 kind of range. And just hold volume a little more steady, just because recovering is going to be a little harder if you're cutting.
Okay.
Right. Similarly, I might, instead of having like 6 exercises per workout, I might do 5. Or maybe I don't push the accessories as hard, right? The other thing you can do, and this might be a bit advanced for today, but we'll take a crack at it anyways. So are you guys familiar with the idea of a projected max, like estimated 1 rep max?
No.
Yeah,
Okay.
there's
Outside of the one post.
calculators on the internet.
Exactly. Yeah, it's those calculators. You'd be like, I did 195 for 5. It'll tell you like, oh, your max is 220 or whatever.
Usually what I've done is I take like the goal and then I'll backtrack what a 24 rep max is and make that my volume. Usually that's how I've been doing it so far.
Yeah, right. So if you have like your estimated 1 rep max is like 220, for example, and then let's say, you know, 240, and you're seeing like, this is actually kind of crazy. I think you should really work on getting stronger with thighs if this is the gap, but that's a separate sidebar. If your projected max is like growing, you know, 10% every month, basically, which is incredibly fast. But if it's growing 10% every month and we're saying, okay, well, basically I kind of want my top set, you know, 260 times 1, I guess it would be, right? Like I want my estimated 1 rep max to be like there, and we're pushing at like 10% increments if I'm on like a maintenance diet, right? If I'm bulking, I can probably push that up a couple percent, where I might see like 11 or 12% progression every month. And if I'm cutting, I'm probably looking more at like half that, probably more like a 5% increase every month, which is incredible. Again, I think there's a couple things with this data set. They're going to make these numbers sound a little crazy. But in setting the projections, right, if we hadn't mapped this already and we were saying, okay, well, normally you're seeing 10% every month. I want to see, you know, projected max sitting around like 5% this month. What do you have to do for a triple to hit a projected max of 230? Okay, well, it's actually like 215. And then that's going to let me pick my top set based on how you go through your progressions. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes, it does.
Yeah. So you got a few ways. You can either go with like an absolute, like this is my best rep max, and that's how I'm going to pick my next, you know, plus 5 pounds kind of thing. But you can also go based on like, okay, well, my estimated max progression month over month is X. And if you've ever seen me post like the little graphs with all the dots on them in like my Instagram stories and stuff, that's screenshots of data from like lifters I'm working with, where it's like, this is 3 months of their projected max. And you can see it's all over the place, but the trend line is up.
Got it. Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's just about everything today without me continuing to talk a hole through my screen. I could go on for days, but I'm keeping it practical and focused on the topic today. That's it. Recording for this will go up into the Facebook group as usual. It'll be up there. And yeah, if you don't already, follow me on Instagram at StrongerYou. And thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate the questions. Definitely helped enrich the presentation today, guys.
Thank you. Merry Christmas.
Hey, Merry Christmas. Happy New Year.
Merry Christmas, guy.
Thank you. All right. Bye-bye.